Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for taking the time to join us for this really cool webinar brought to you by the Streaming Video Alliance. It's called Reducing Churn, Building Engagement, and Delighting Subscribers. And we will be exploring lots of different topics as it relates to making a better user experience for for video viewing and, sort of how to improve that user experience, how to measure it, et cetera, et cetera. So just a couple of housekeeping things. This webinar is being recorded, so we will make it available probably later this afternoon or tomorrow, at which time you can, send it around to colleagues. It will also get sent to everybody who registered but couldn't attend. We also have a slight change in the presenters. Unfortunately, Aditya Ganjam from Conviva could not make it at the last minute. So we still have three really excellent, very experienced people to talk about this topic. So I think we're going to have a great discussion regardless, but I just wanted to bring that to your attention. And then the last thing, just kind of logistics, is I'm going to give a little introduction about the Streaming Video Alliance, and then we'll hand it over to our presenters to talk about themselves a little bit. So, who they are and, why they're here, why they're in this webinar, a little bit about their company, and then we will jump into questions. So a little bit about the Streaming Video Alliance. If you're not familiar with the organization, we are a global organization, and we're focused on really solving critical challenges in the streaming video space. So we bring together companies from across the video ecosystem. We have content owners and network operators and service providers and technology companies to collaborate on three primary things. One of those is education. So we develop content like white papers and ebooks and other things to help educate the market on what the challenges with streaming video at scale is. The second thing is we provide a forum for that collaboration. So we have working groups and quarterly face-to-face meetings where our members come together to solve those problems. And then we have what we call definition. So we work together as a group to really define solutions to the problems. And a lot of those come out as specifications or functional requirements or best practices or guidelines. And we publish those and make those available publicly to anyone who wants to use and adopt these definitions for helping them create a better viewer experience with their streaming video. All right, and you can obviously find more. Our website address is at the bottom of the slide, so if you're interested, go and take a look and download docs and all sorts of other fun things. All right, let's hand it over to our presenters. So Nick, why don't you give us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So most of my background's been in kind of the post-house, big media, big asset management systems and streaming business. Kind of started out more in the former, which is the post-house industry, and transitioned to a few different streaming providers such as Netflix and CISO. And then most recently, I'm leading product and product innovation at OWNZONES, which from a kind of elevator pitch standpoint is building all of the entertainment technology that takes content to consumers. So most of my background is around building the front-end user experiences, the discovery experience, and just overall SVOD, AVOD platforms.
Excellent. That sounds great. And John, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Great, thanks. Yeah, my name is Jonathan Shields. I'm Vice President of Sales for Nice People at Work. I cover North America, Australia, New Zealand, UK, Ireland, responsible for the new business side and also for all of our existing customers in those regions. I've been in the video delivery space for around 8 years now, based out of New York City. My other homes are Delta Airlines and Sheraton and Marriott hotels. But I've been a member of the SVA for many years, and it's nice to meet all you folks.
Fantastic. And unfortunately, it looks like Brenton has not joined, so hopefully he will jump in at some point in the near future, and he can get involved in the discussion. So right now, let's start out with a little bit of a high-level topic. Obviously, churn is a big issue, probably the number one business issue, and technology issue for streaming video distributors and content owners and providers. But, I think there's maybe sort of a misconception or a misunderstanding, or maybe just not agreement on sort of the user experience, right? What is the video user experience? Is it just the app? Is it the app plus the content? Is it underlying technologies like delivery and discovery and how those relate to it? You know, Nick, I was wondering with your background, if you could talk a little bit about sort of what you feel are the components of a streaming video user experience.
Sure, yeah. So I guess at an extremely high level, maybe oversimplified, I think about it as playback and discovery. And I think most things can be fit into those two categories. I think that one of the reasons why it might be hard to define exactly what the components of a streaming service are is because they shouldn't be uniform for every single streaming service. I think your monetization model, your content, obviously your user, drastically define and impact, what the right strategies are for you. And I think that, streaming as a whole has taken a somewhat uniform approach. I mean, I think that there's definitely variations out there, especially from like a user experience and front end perspective. But I think there's a lot of opportunity to continue to diversify and really optimize around what's best for the user.
How do you feel, sort of, what about the underlying technologies? Would you consider, components like content delivery or caching or, encoding, transcoding? Would you consider those to be part of, or I guess, influencing the user experience?
Absolutely. I think it's oftentimes something that a lot of people forget about or don't value enough. I think it's incredibly hard to have a really robust, redundant, performant back-end infrastructure and architecture. Some of the, I guess, speakers on this panel obviously represent companies that help you monitor the CDN health, your rebuffering rate, caching, etc. But, I think that it is an incredibly difficult part of a streaming service. And when you have people like Netflix that, is optimizing around extremely low bitrate encode so that they can better penetrate markets that are mobile only with really bad infrastructure, such as like India, that's the bar that is set. And so the more that they perfect that, the more that the consumer notices the difference when you don't. And so I think there's a very high bar in that area. The good news is that, the more streaming proliferates, the more options there are to kind of integrate and put solutions in your architecture and not have to build it yourself. So I think that it's getting easier, but it's always a moving bar. And obviously equally important is the discovery experience. So it can be hard to be good at both simultaneously.
Well, that makes total sense. John, what are your thoughts on sort of the components of, the streaming video user experience? Obviously, you come from, a different perspective, being a vendor who provides, measurement and analytics services to the streaming video market. What are your thoughts on sort of what the components are? And I guess, and I've got a follow-up question to that in a second, but I'll kind of leave it there for you to answer that first.
Yeah, thanks, JT. I think there's obviously a lot of different pieces to the puzzle as we're starting to uncover, and Nick mentioned. I think first and foremost, just kind of understanding, your top level metrics in your environment, whether that might be buffer, join time, play time, exit before video starts. So just understanding a baseline as to your performance metrics. Those metrics obviously change, when you leave North America and maybe Western Europe. So understanding kind of, how you're doing in Asia Pac or Africa, if you have a kind of a global ecosystem, and then really kind of setting those, thresholds and metrics to, better monitor your end user ecosystem. So I think those are some of the kind of factors in better understanding kind of baseline where you're at and what you're looking to do, and then go from there.
Do you find, or does nice people at work find that there are specific things that need to be measured? So let me explain that a little bit more. Obviously, there are components like Nick described that make up or influence the user experience. What are the things, what are the the major elements that, you guys as a company and that you've seen across the industry that need to be measured. And even beyond that, are there thresholds that you think people should adhere to? Like, hey, buffering ratio should really be XYZ, and we've seen that, across the industry. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so definitely I think getting a baseline of kind of where you're at from a performance metric standpoint. There's a lot of different metrics that can be reported on, but the basic high level stuff just would be kind of buffer join time, play time, exit before video starts. And as you said, kind of setting thresholds and notifications when a set of users is experiencing something as an outlier. And if you're going to be able to compete with some of the bigger players in the market from a performance standpoint, you definitely need to understand those and really proactively fix the issues that are impacting those metrics, that are impacting your overall engagement. I think some of the data examples we would use is that a large broadcaster had a 65% increase in playtime over the first 12 months when implementing QoS. At the same time, they also reduced by 32% kind of the exit before video start metrics. So they didn't know what they didn't know, and they were able to then proactively fix those issues to increase plays and reduce exits. The other piece that I would mention is, when buffer ratios are greater than 2%, churn will increase by around 30%. When buffer ratio is less than 1%, your play time will increase by 2.5x. And then I think also when you talk about other metrics like join time, if it's greater than 20 seconds, your abandonment's going to be around 40%. So there are absolute correlations between the metrics and your customer engagement, churn, and so forth. So.
Okay, and Nick, do you have any thoughts on that as well? I mean, based on your experience?
Not too much to add. I completely agree. Like, there's high correlations between performance metrics and like the impact on your user and their retention and engagement. And I think, if you're a very small service, it's about kind of figuring out what creates the most impact to improve, because you're just resource constrained and it's not possible to do everything. So focusing on some of the metrics that were just mentioned is definitely the right move. As you start to get a larger user base, more statistical significance, you can start to get into a lot of those additional data points that are much more granular, but much more impactful as your user base grows. And I think it also, like, you take a similar strategy to your architecture and your technology that you use to, create your service as well, where you focus on kind of the meat and potatoes initially, making sure that you have just a solid playback experience and your content's up on your site and your app or wherever. And then you start to optimize and create a better and better experience based on some of the learnings you get from data, as well as just, your overall, observations that you get from your user base.
Sure. I mean, and that makes total sense. I find it kind of interesting, actually, that I think in the video space, because it, for all intents and purposes, streaming video comes out of sort of broadcast, right? And the broadcast mentality has always been about QoS, right? Sort of, network optimization and how well things are being delivered. And I think there's a very large emphasis in the market on sort of collecting data that describes that delivery process for streaming video, right? So you look at buffer ratio and, sort of the mechanics of delivery. But I think a lot of emphasis is being lost on sort of the touch and feel of, the video experience itself. So how easy is it to access content? How simple is it to find new content? And I think that there's definitely a correlation between these two needs, right? We need to measure what's happening, but then we also need to understand how the users are interacting with the video service itself. And I think that's, maybe that's something, Nick, that you can talk to a little bit, sort of, what are, the design or interface considerations that need to be made in order to capture the most user engagement with the streaming service? Because obviously, you could have the best rebuffer ratio in the world, but your interface could be terrible and people would still churn. So what needs to happen? What do distributors need to keep in mind when they're building those interfaces?
Well, I think preliminary research, user testing, prototyping, and a really, really solid understanding of your brand, what size content catalog you have, how often it's being refreshed, what genres are you trying to attack? Are you trying to be a little bit of everything? Are you trying to be extremely niche? Those are really important strategic questions that inform what the right strategy is, or at least what your initial strategy is before you have users to inform it. So I think that not doing due diligence in that capacity and just kind of assuming that you're going to use like a straightforward Netflix-like, YouTube, whatever layout can be a mistake, depending on exactly what you're trying to accomplish. But then also putting a lot of emphasis, early on being able to collect behavioral metrics and making sure that you have really robust eventing around your front end experience beyond, obviously QoS or like you said, some of the technical infrastructure. We spend incredible amounts of time making sure that like the apps that we build have really robust eventing and a really nice data warehouse that those get funneled into, so that you can pivot quickly and continue to add features from a front end user experience that capitalize on how your users are using the service. So for like to give kind of a tactical example, I think like Netflix, Amazon, Tubi TV, some of these services that have potentially tens of thousands of pieces of content, it's really like algorithmic suggestion and a bunch of content rows and something for everyone works really well, and it informs what their interface looks like. But if I'm a smaller provider that has a niche audience and a much smaller content catalog, I think engagement and retention can look a lot more like not just video playback, but engagement across the community and social sharing, things that probably the larger catalog and larger companies put less of an emphasis on because they want people just constantly engaged because they have enough content to do so.
I mean, and that definitely makes sense. So I guess if you look at it, right, there are kind of two big components of, sort of maximizing engagement, creating happy subscribers, which ultimately, from a business perspective, hopes to mitigate churn. And those two components are this sort of, kind of metrics analysis, the mechanics of delivery, and playback, right? So just, I guess, call it mechanics. And then on the other side, there is this, sort of interface, user experience component as well, both of which obviously have to be measured in their own ways. Quick question, Nick, is there any way that, our, attendees can sort of understand how do you measure the effectiveness of an interface element or an interface in general? Is there something that they can do to do that?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to that kind of strategy and then implementation like narrative from before. I think it's really important to define what your KPIs are. And I mean, it's really easy to say, we want people to play a bunch of content, or we're looking at number of hours played per week per user. And those are, by and large, good metrics to look at because I think everyone's overall objective is engagement in some form. But I think that you have to really be solid in what exactly you're trying to achieve early on. Is it, extreme engagement with specific pieces of content for brand building? And therefore, it's more optimized around a certain quantity of content per month that people then, walk away feeling like, wow, this is something that I want to come back to, versus trying to optimize for 20 hours a week when you have 100 hours of content overall, right? And I'm just kind of being flippant about the examples, but I think it's all backing out your strategy, defining those KPIs and making sure that you can correctly track for those things and that you're watching them closely, especially as a product team, to evolve your approach and constantly, gathering user feedback, doing surveys, polling people, especially if you don't have a huge amount of users, which I think is the consistent problem that I see throughout this industry. There's a lot of people that want to get into it, but they don't have an established consumer base and they're used to linear, which I don't think is necessarily a great representation always of exactly what they should be doing. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, and it sort of leads me to, to the next question, which is, really if you have these two components and you have different ways to measure them, obviously, in order to make use of those measurements, you need to, operationalize them. So, John, one of the things that NPOD does really well is you guys have dashboards and reports and, ways to slice and dice the data so you can drill down into it and you can make, meaningful business decisions based on what you see. How can streaming services, whether it's a Netflix or, a niche content provider like a Crunchyroll, which I believe just got acquired by AT&T, how can they, improve how they incorporate these measurements, this data that they're grabbing from the various aspects of their viewer experience into operations and more importantly, into customer service? What are ways that they can do that?
Yeah, so I think from a video operation team standpoint, this is kind of a must-have nowadays to understand, the ISPs, the CDNs, all the way down to the individual users. So if you kind of want to be the best in your space and kind of grow revenue, it's extremely well advised to have a QoS analytics kind of insights. Operations can then know kind of real time what's going on in the entire environment globally, and then when issues do pop up, you have the ability to say, is this individual user that's having a thing? Is it an individual stream? And what the issues are. So we talked about kind of setting alerting and metrics and thresholds. You can predetermine those to what you define as unacceptable and get a kind of advanced warning regarding something that's going awry in the system. And then from a customer support standpoint, if I were to call in to a customer support center and they pick up the phone and say, hey, John, I know you're watching this TV series on this device and you're connected to the Verizon ISP and you're having kind of a little bit of a buffer experience right now, I would feel very comfortable if they have a handle on it and they're working on it. But if I were to call into a customer support center and they were to say, what issue are you having? What device are you using? What are you watching on? What's your location? And they don't know certain information about me, and they say that, we'll look into and get back to you, that's not a shop or a service that I'm comfortable that's kind of got it under control. So, would you potentially cancel that service as a thing? And I think we've had some, good customer data regarding, we had a customer that saw a 42% reduction in their call center volume when it came to video quality of service issues in the first 6 months. So just really understanding what's going on out there can drastically reduce the call center support calls. And then we had an existing customer who launched the new platform and a new piece of content just before Christmas. They had been acquired for a couple $100 million, and within 2 hours they had 30,000 complaints, and they had a pretty big outage and issue, and they were going to just roll out our service, January 1st when the new year came around. But it was a costly mistake that, easily could have been avoided. And, when we kind of looked into the root cause of the issue, we would have notified on it and resolved it probably within less than 1 minute, and this whole thing would have been avoided. So I think those are kind of just two examples of how it can be used from a video operations understanding standpoint, linked in then to customer support to really provide a premier service.
I mean, that makes total sense. All right, so obviously, I just got an text message from Brenton at Touchstream. He's going to be joining us shortly, and I've got some delivery / infrastructure related questions for him, because I think those are important elements of understanding and measuring the mechanics of the video experience, sort of how it's being delivered and, how that impacts this concept of engagement and churn and making happy users. But, let's talk a little bit about the future of sort of measuring the user experience. Obviously, new technologies are coming, to us pretty quickly, whether it's, things that improve latency or, ways that, data can be predicted and things can be done, based on those predictions rather than waiting for people to look at the data manually. I guess this question kind of goes to both of you. And, maybe Nick, maybe you can start us out, just based on, some of the stuff you've seen at Netflix and, some of the stuff you're seeing at OWNZONES now. Are there new technologies, like artificial intelligence and machine learning and things like that, that will help predict, in a sense, when users will be upset so that they can, so that video distributors and streaming services can make decisions even before the bad stuff happens?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly as it gets better and better, I think sometimes with those technologies, algorithmic suggestion included, regardless of whether it's powered by AI or ML, they're still dependent on having enough data to make them effective. And I've seen, at places like CISO and OWNZONES that sometimes manual curation and editorial of the front-end user experience and catalog can be pretty effective. And it's obviously not scalable long-term, but it depends on, again, your audience, how niche the category is. So specifically for like the discovery experience and informing like what gets merchandised to consumers, I think you have to have enough data to be really effective at it. But conversely, like some of the really cool things that I think we're starting to employ AI and ML for, at OWNZONES right now, we're using it to kind of create rich metadata around the content, early on in the supply chain, so that you can use that to better inform the merchandising experiences on the front end. Again, an example of that would be kind of looking at the number of shots of fields and boats and sentiment analysis, like you said before. We've used things like Gray Meta and recognition from AWS to be able to get that data from a feed, and then use that to then create categories of content on the front end that are categorized by different things that are most effective for your user base. So in that sense, like I think it can be really powerful from a content analysis standpoint, but purely using it to make merchandising decisions based on behavior of users requires quite a large user base to be more effective than something that's like manually curated.
What are your thoughts on that, John?
Yes, there's a couple of different kind of ways to look at this one. I think one, obviously, we're looking at the quality of service kind of metrics and insights. There's the ability to pull, at least from the Eubora technology platform, and all of our customers use it, is raw events. So taking this information, we're collecting about 40 or 50 metrics per play. Taking these events and using it in other big data systems to make content recommendation, search engine recommendation, and you can actually start to see, based on a user's interaction with the content, the length, the access, and everything else, is this person, increasing and happy with the service and the content and everything else that's being provided, or are they on the downturn? And do we need to try to maybe reach out to them to try to save them? And actually, one of the things that we've seen a recent uptick in is not only how are ads interacting or affecting engagement, but also how is overall churn being managed from a bottom end standpoint. So traditionally, providers are looking at how many new subscribers are coming onto the platform of the technology, but having the ability to kind of predict churn within kind of of your bottom 1% that are most likely to churn. What are the metrics associated with that? So we're seeing a lot of that information now being used proactively rather than reactively when it comes to whether it's quality of service, whether it's churn, whether it's back-end data systems being fed with the information that we have. So we're seeing it used in a variety of different ways by a variety of different systems.
That's very interesting, and I think that kind of brings up, I guess, a bigger sort of future forward-looking question, which is really around around reducing churn, right? So obviously there's kind of two components to subscribers leaving, right? There are some technical difficulties. Again, those could be mechanical, so the delivery could just be bad. Those could be sort of interface related, like it's hard to find content, or discovery's terrible, or playback, the player is kludgy, whatever that is. And then there's, this sort of, there's the content side of it, right? So a service that has all of the mechanics and the interface right, but it doesn't have the content, is, not going to have subscribers either. So, I guess in your words, and maybe we can start with John this time, sort of what kind of advice would you give to a streaming service provider regarding sort of the future of churn? Here's what you need to do over the next 2 to 3 years to really keep users engaged, in your service and with your, your user experience.
So I think first and foremost, it would just be kind of understanding the baseline of every individual user that's, a subscriber to your service. So really just getting a sample baseline and then starting to work with that over time to see how adding new content might impact your overall audience. So one of the things that we also look at is, content dashboards regarding what content is trending and what's not, and where people are dropping off during a video and maybe why. So really a closed loop ecosystem that's constantly analyzing, whether it's the quality of service, whether it's the engagement, whether it's the content, whether it might be the impact of the interface or the search engine recommendations. So really just keeping the information flowing. And I know that a lot of these companies are using a lot of kind of third-party data tools to analyze, big data or, business intelligence metrics, and really just having that information to make better decisions when you're adding new content or adding new platforms. Are they working? Are they not? And then just really having the data to make smarter business decisions, I think is really the key thing that we're seeing, that this is the next phase or evolution. And I will say there are a lot of companies out there that are still flying blind, and they do, sometimes $1 billion in revenue. But that's, that's an, anomaly, not, the norm. Is that, taking accountability for your subscriber base and caring about the overall experience and really trying to be the best you can at, the service you're trying to provide.
And Nick, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think a consistent theme of kind of what I've been saying is I think it's all about making a great experience for the user. And, if that example, like, someone doing $1 billion in revenue and not really doing the due diligence they need to make sure they have a great customer experience, probably won't be doing $1 billion in revenue for much longer. That's what I think is really great about streaming and over the top in general, is it creates a lot more choice for the consumer. And, with I guess legacy linear systems, just simply less choice because of regulations, ISPs, etc. And the interfaces also weren't as impactful as they are now. The discovery experience, certainly the performance of the architecture, as you had alluded to earlier, the QoS metrics have always been a really big part of this industry, but so much more of the performance is now related to the discovery of the content as well, and the features and functionality that help you go from one piece of content to the other, that you have to do due diligence, monitor, and pay attention to those things, or you're going to have really frustrated customers that might stick around for as long as you have great content, but will take the first opportunity to jump ship once you don't.
Absolutely. All right. Well, it doesn't look like Brenton is going to be able to join us, unfortunately. So right now we don't have any audience questions, which is fine. Obviously, both Nick and John are available, to answer questions offline. If you have anything that you want to ask them, please just send the email to me and I will forward it on to them and we'll get that conversation started. But I do want to thank everybody for taking, half an hour out of your day to listen to both Nick and John talk about, this concept of churn and engagement and measurement and sort of what that all means together and how to improve it really, especially, going into the next, 12, 20, 24 months of your streaming service. So again, thank you so much for joining us. We'll be posting this webinar on our website a little bit later today, and we'll be sending out emails and social information about how to access it. Thanks so much, everybody, and hope you have a wonderful day.
Great, thank you.